Okay, we're recording. Okay, we are starting. Welcome everybody to the House Divided class series. We are in the last session tonight, chapter 8 on social isolation and suicide. So we are being led tonight by Panay Duncan. We'll lead the discussion. And before we do that, I want to do the usual announcements. We are recording this for future playback. And please mute yourself in the lower left corner of your screen. Click on it so it's got the red line through it. We won't hear background noise. And I will try and do the same so my dog doesn't bark. And finally, be kind and be judicious in your comments. Don't dominate too much. Sometimes we have folks who like to talk a little too much, and we like to spread it around the opportunity to participate. So with that, I turn it over to Panay.
Okie dokie. First, since this is our last class, I want to thank Steve for being our Zoom host and class leader for all of these weeks. Yes.
Oh, thank you, Panay.
And yes, tonight's our final House Divided. And as Laura said last week, it's also been a privilege for me to be together and explore these important topics. I've appreciated our class time and all of you who have so beautifully shared. I've also appreciated the book. One of the things I really appreciate about the book are the prayers in each chapter that bracket the discussion sections. I'm going to try and share screen and pull up the prayer. We'll see if I can do it. Do you see the prayer?
Yes.
Good. See, it worked. Okay. Yeah. So what I want you to do is mute yourself, and then you can read along as I read it. But if you're not muted, please don't read along, or there's all this feedback that confuses me. Okay. So if you mute yourself again, I invite you to read along. Let us pray. Christ, our companion, Lord of the lost and lonely, when the world is cold and the way is dark and we know not where to turn for comfort, remind us that there is comfort and shelter in your presence. Let your word speak into the silence and shame, saying, "Come to me, all you who labor and are heavily burdened, and I will refresh you." Amen. So jumping right in, I was struck by some of the statistics on social isolation, especially Generation Z, those who were born between 1995 and 2012 is the loneliest generation. I was struck because those people are my grandchildren. I was also struck that the United Kingdom has a minister of loneliness. So what I want to do, start out doing is to brainstorm factors that we can think of that contribute to social isolation and loneliness. Include your own too, and that of others. So just let's pop out some of those factors that we think contribute to social isolation and loneliness. Okay, I get to go first. COVID. Now I took the easiest one, so you guys have to work harder.
Well, I think for grandkids, too much time on their devices, because that's, to me, that's lonely. That's not really fellowship.
Very good. Devices.
And social media, I think people develop relationships that they think are real, and they're just people that's on the other end of the screen, and there's actually no personal interactions with them.
Social media.
I think a lot of
kids are in so many different ballet and sports and all of these different kinds of things. And so many children, they're not the best. And so they end up feeling lonely because they're not appreciated, they're not accepted because they're not as good as some of the rest of them.
Ah, okay. Activities where you might not get a good self-image out of them. Yeah.
You know, I'll add to that a little bit. I think there's so much going on in a family these days that there's not necessarily a lot of meaningful conversation because people are running 3 different ways, 5 different ways, how many there are in the family. And the time that they spend together is probably very short, in the car on the way to practice, on the car on the way to school. And they just don't really sit down and communicate much.
Good point. Overly busy families.
Lack of quality time, but also lack of quality sleep.
Ooh, good one. Lack of quality sleep. That would be a whole other string of explanations for that, but yes.
I think Lon's looking a little too comfortable.
I would offer that one of the cherished memories of my childhood was the family dinner table. And I'm not sure that we have enough of that for our children now. I think there's too much, let's go out and grab a burger, let's have a pizza, let's eat it in front of the television set or whatever. But the conversation that was parent driven at my house, at least, I think is so valuable to generation, would be so valuable to Generation Z.
That no family dinner, yes. Well, keep thinking, and if you want to add to the list later, just let me know.
Maybe one other name, maybe no church in the center of the family life.
Obviously, we know church attendance is not at St. Andrew, but church attendance is down in our country. Okay, the book shares this from Brene Brown. She says, we socially sort ourselves into like-minded groups with dire consequences. Now, do you think it's true that what one believes about climate change, whites and racism, immigrants, healthcare for all, medical aid in dying, Islamic extremism, homosexuality, gun control, and the realities of COVID, do you think that what one believes is informed by and limited by social sorting with like-minded people?
Well, Kim spent the afternoon with Ron and Ron discussing the church issues and political issues.
Okay.
Renee, when I read this section, at first I thought this was talking about social isolation, like folks who are sorted into their own group or feeling isolated, but I don't think that's really what it's getting at. I think it's getting at we're isolated from people who are different than ourselves, our own thinking. So if you watch only Fox News or MSNBC, you are just in a category with folks who are thinking like yourself. And you may have friends you are close to, but you are not getting exposed and making friendships with people who think differently. I thought that was a good point about this.
I absolutely agree with the idea that, how you are influenced is from the people that you associate with, and it starts at birth. and the environment you're in before you even have any idea of how your own agency in sorting yourself. I think you're already sorted to begin with, and some people break away from that or take a different direction. But I think a lot of us, we're well into our adulthood before we realize our own agency in deciding what to think and what to believe.
Yeah, might it keep us from that proverbial walking in another's shoes? It might just limit us from a chance, like you've sort of said, of community, of greater community.
Panay,
Yes.
given the title of the chapter, I'm thinking of the social isolation that comes in that age group. Would you say Gen Z, where bullying and status symbols, what you wear and what you can afford, the Nikes that you wear and how you got them is can define the group that you're in, and either you should or shouldn't belong to, because it's just dangerous to your mental health.
That's a good point about how social sorting starts or is in actuality during one's school years. Literally your jeans or your tennis shoes. Okay, so I'm going to ask Steve to show the video. We'll jump into the video now. Again, social isolationism and suicide.
Okay, here we go.
Out so I can see my neighbor as myself. Give me doubt so I can lay all my weapons on the ground. When the armor of God is too heavy for peace, give me doubt. Give me doubt.
If you've ever been to the Holy Land, chances are you've visited the Dead Sea. The Dead Sea is the lowest land depression in the world, about 400 meters below sea level. It's part of the Great Rift Valley, which extends down into Africa. The Dead Sea is known in Hebrew as Yam Hamalah, the Sea of Salt. It's about 30% salt, nearly 8 times the salt content of the ocean. That's too salty to sustain life. Any fish unfortunate to be washed down the Jordan into the Dead Sea will almost immediately die. Scientists have discovered 11 species of bacteria that manage to survive in that environment, but for all practical purposes, the Dead Sea is true to its name. Why is it dead? Because the Dead Sea has no outlets. Water flows in from Jordan, but there's no way for the water to get out. The water evaporates, leaving behind sediment and elements that make life unsustainable. There's so much that lies deep in the human heart that longs for an outlet. Secrets, traumas, memories, anxieties, old wounds, fresh grievances, hopes, and dreams. If these can't find a way out, they make life unsustainable for us. We need trusted confidants with whom to share them. We're wired for community and connection. Our species has survived only because there is safety in numbers. Our earliest human ancestors on the savannas knew that separation from the tribe meant extreme hardship and almost certain death. But today in the US, We've never been more disconnected from each other. 1 in 4 Americans rarely or never feels as though there are people who really understand them. Nearly 5 out of 10 Americans report feeling always or sometimes lonely. 1 in 5 Americans reports that they rarely or never feel close to people or feel like they have people with whom they can talk. Only 1 out of 2 Americans have meaningful in-person social interactions, like having an extended conversation with a friend or spending quality time with family on a daily basis. And this lack of meaningful social connection is killing us. In the US, a person born in 1900 could expect to live to the age of 49. In 2000, that person's great-grandchildren were likely to see their 77th birthdays. Reaching old age is no longer an anomaly, and that's true for people of every race, ethnicity, and social class. But around 2000 came a stark and dramatic reversal of that trend. For white Americans between the ages of 45 and 54, average life expectancy was no longer increasing. In fact, it was declining in a pattern seen almost nowhere else on Earth. Much of the decline stems from higher rates of suicide, opioid overdoses, and alcohol-related illnesses, the so-called deaths of despair. Americans are ending their lives at a rate never before seen in our country's history. The coronavirus pandemic has only exacerbated this trend. Suicide is already the 10th leading cause of death in the US, with a 35% rise in the suicide rate between 1999 and 2018. But as COVID-19 brings added economic stress, increased social isolation, the loss of community and religious contact, and new barriers to mental health resources, we'll likely be facing an emotional health pandemic of epic proportions in the months and years ahead. There has never before been a more urgent time than now to talk about mental health and suicide, and to discover new and meaningful ways to bring people into deeper connection and a sense of belonging. This is the life-saving work of kinship and the life-giving work of kenosis. And through this work, we can save lives, and we can create a community in which no one is left behind on the savannas of our modern world. Despite all of our differences, we all share the same pain, and we all share the same calling to work together for the common good.
Give me doubt so I can see my neighbor as myself. Give me doubt so I can lay all my weapons on the ground. When the armor of God is too heavy for peace, I shall not fear.
Thanks, Steve. What struck you in the video? Maybe a new insight? Remember, you have to unmute if somebody's trying to talk.
Yeah, I think something that struck me very much is the direction you're going with this. And I'll use a very personal instance to explain where this went for me. My brother and I had a pact after his wife died. He was not going to do anything until his grandchildren graduated from college. And in less than 6 months, he blew his brains out. That's something to think about when we're talking about suicide. There's a whole lot of social issues behind him that probably allowed that to happen. But he made a commitment to me that he was not going to do that until the kids had graduated from college, grandkids. So I just throw that out as another opportunity to think about when you're talking about suicide.
Well, you asked what struck us. What struck me were the statistics. They're just chilling.
The statistics are chilling, yes. Did the Dead Sea speak to any of you?
Spoke to me. I had never gotten emotional about a body of water before until that video, when all of a sudden when he said there's no outlets and there's no way for it to get out, it just, I don't know, got me right in the feels. Because I see that, I feel that sometimes. I see that in the students that I work with. So yeah, that hit me for sure.
The statistic that hit me was the age group that had the highest suicide rate. And it hit me when I read that in the chapter. I was really surprised by that. It's the, what was it, 47 to 53 or something like that. I was like, wow, of men.
Men, yeah.
White men.
Do you believe that there's a correlation, as the book and the video suggest, between social isolation and increased social isolation and increase in suicide?
I would say, Panay, I'm going to go back to the statistic as well. My 3 kids are all 4.5, 5 years apart. So, and pardon my bird in the background. They've had the same school counselor throughout the entire time they were all 3 in high school, and they're all 3 graduated now. But I went in, had gotten to know their counselor really well with the life circumstances that we were going through. And she mentioned to me that the amount of kids that were on suicide watch was amazing, that the majority of the time spent for the counselors at school now, where they would have been deciding, you know, who needed this chemistry, who needs 4 more credits here, schools to look into, college, making sure you're, you know, on track in high school. They hardly have time to spend doing that at all anymore. And it is all more on the social isolation, the suicide watch. And I asked her what she felt was the biggest contributor to that. And it's kind of like what Ron said, the social media was causing extreme grief for a lot of kids who then felt they couldn't live up to it, or whatever the occasion might be. But that was the biggest reason that they could pinpoint, that so many kids were suffering, and that the job of them now is not to be, like I said, an academic counselor. It's more like a counselor for grief and depression and anxiety. So that was very striking, very upsetting.
Missy, I thought that was a good point you made. I was just thinking that before the internet, we had bullying at school, of course, but it was not as prevalent and quickly communicated and spread between kids as it seems to be now. Social media, they don't even have to be at school. They can just post something and tell a fellow student to kill themselves, and we hear more and more of those stories in the media about how that has happened.
And that goes, Steve, just thank you for saying that, because that also, one of the things that is huge with that is they are seeing, because kids can post that very second what they're going to do. So they say, oh, great, well, my friends all went out to do such and such, and they didn't invite me. And they can see that right in their faces at that very moment. Whereas, you know, back in the day, we might have heard about it later and certainly had our feelings hurt, but not just Instagram and all the rest of it showing right now what you're missing out on, and that your friends didn't care enough to invite you along, I know has been extremely difficult. And I do know some of my daughter's friends, for a while, they just got off of it because they were sick of getting their feelings hurt. So I thought that was really healthy.
It's kind of like a 24-hour news cycle to compare the adults watching TV news all the time, adding to the stress that we feel, and that's why we shut off the news sometimes. I think it's the same thing for the kids, a 24-hour bully cycle.
I'm going to pop something up on the screen. Do you see this? Many of us know that St. Andrew's vision is to eradicate social isolation and disconnection by practicing the faithful presence of the incarnate Christ. Rev Mark, in our annual meeting the Sunday before last, talked about where St. Andrew is going. And he shared the link to this event in his weekly email last Wednesday, if you missed it. But he talked about what's important to St. Andrew today using C, D, and E rather than A, B, and C. A, B, and C is attendance, the building, you know, cash coming in, the need for cash. So what's C, D, and E? C was connection within the congregation, the community, and the world. D was dissemination of the inclusive word of Christ. And E was engagement in ministries through things like life groups that will soon be offered, through a new COVID-informed and inspired virtual St. Andrew campus, inviting membership from all over the globe, and through continued progress on our wellness initiative with the formation of a task force and the eventual hiring of an executive director. So why are these steps important?
To kind of follow on my husband's and also what other people were saying about the kids, the church can counter a lot of that loneliness. From my perspective, I think Chris's brother was so incredibly lonely by his own choice, and not really being, they had dropped out of the church before she died. And so he did not have the church as support. And of course, we've talked about the kids not having, I forget, somebody else on my screen over here talked about the kids not having church as central to their life. I know a lot of kids, it's not even not central, it's not. And I think that bringing people into the church, even if they're just in Florida, is still going to improve on that isolation.
Anybody else want to comment on why our vision and our new look is really important today?
Well, I think there's a lot of churches, if you walk into them and you're not a member, it's like a clique. They're so tight knit that they don't really, acknowledge outsiders. They don't reach out their hand and shake their hands. And I think that's what, part of the thing that just kind of drives kids away is there's so many cliques in high school that isolate them and everything. And then the parents take them to church, and the church is the same way. I think that's what Mark's whole point is that everybody can come in and we will welcome everybody.
I'd like to mention that is not just for teenagers. I think it's wonderful that your church is being proactive in this regard and trying to reach out to people, and you do. When we have been there, we have always felt very welcome. We joined a church 3 years ago here in Florida, and we still feel isolated from that church. We joined the choir, and we could sing in the choir, and that was kind of fun. And we had 2 or 3 people that we could talk to, but the people in that church have not reached out. So it isn't just the teenagers, it's the elderly and people in between that are isolated. And we do it without realizing it. It's a human thing to kind of gather, and the cliques that you mentioned are really quite common wherever you go. But I think it's important for us as Christians to work very, very hard to overcome that. I also want to mention the fact that I believe in general, neighboring is not what it used to be. And I think that is another thing that contributes greatly to the social isolation. You don't really know your neighbors. We're supposed to love our neighbors, but if we don't know them, it's pretty hard to love them.
So add neighboring to our ongoing list. Good idea.
Perhaps we should add virtual potlucks. Again, connections and continuity. I had a business associate who was from China. He'd gone to high school there, and he graduated in finance at the University of Illinois, Champaign. And I happened to ask him one day, in high school, how many close friends did you have? He came from a community of 8 million west of Shanghai. And east of Shanghai, backwards. And to my surprise, he said 300. Without hesitation, 300 close friends. And I suppose that, in the near future, 2050, they're talking about cities, mega cities, how many mega cities there'll be in the world. Each mega city will be on the order of 20 million each. Mexico City is almost there now. And we're right to scale up St. Andrew and do what Mark has brought out. It's a valuable concept.
Yeah, Panay, I would add too that, when I think about connections, I mean, I have 3 daughters. They're 26, 24, and 23. And the beautiful thing about my daughters growing up is that they were all very different. And I can remember my oldest daughter was a socialite, and she had lots of friends, and she was always at the party, very responsible. She was always the one taking everybody home, right? But she was very popular. She was a socialite. She had lots of friends. And then my middle daughter maybe had 2 friends and never had a boyfriend until she was a freshman in college. And then my youngest daughter literally had 1 friend from preschool to high school, and had her first boyfriend when she was a junior in high school, and stayed with that boy for about 4 years. But the thing, and I think this is what we need to be careful about, right? Is that I don't necessarily think it's the quantity of people. I think it's meaningful, quality, intimate relationships, right? And in my mind, I think this is part of our vision at St. Andrew with these life groups, right? Is getting you connected with 8 to 10 people that you can exist in an intimate, safe, trustworthy setting, you know, and to be connected at that level with somebody. Because like, you know, Laura said, you know, I mean, outlets, you know, you know, you have two choices, right? I always used to tell my girls this: you can either get it out or you can just bottle it up inside, right? Like those are your two choices. And believe me, the latter is just, it's just dangerous after a while. It just doesn't work. So I don't know, keep that in mind. You know, I don't know, when we set standards for people in relationships, I really believe in quality over quantity. And I think it's different for every single person. You know what I mean? I think some people are gonna seek out lots of relationships, and some people are just gonna need one or two. You know what I mean? To fulfill them.
Thanks, Jerry. The book says, and we're already talking about it, but the book says not only are we the loneliest generation in history, but we're also the most anxious and depressed, and we're killing ourselves at ever increasing numbers. I do want to note that in the book, it is acknowledged that anxious and depressed attempt suicide, and not all suicides are the result of anxiety and depression. There are other causes as well, but there is a significant connection. Again, throughout the book, another thing I appreciate about the book is we benefit from Mark's research, which again struck me, and it struck some of you in the video there too. But as we've talked about, I have two sons, males, where suicide is more common, but I have daughter-in-laws too, and female suicide is on the increase. Their age is in the group where suicide is the fourth leading cause of death. But then the grandchildren, suicide is the second leading cause of death for children, youth, and young adults. And suicide attempts and deaths are on the rise. So I looked to see if there was any information I could find that was COVID influence data. And I found a report from the Wellbeing Trust Fund that 75,000 additional people could die from what they called deaths of despair, which was also in the video, and that includes suicide and substance abuse. 75,000, all because of COVID-19, both from the physical symptoms of the virus and all the psychological and sociological factors, including physical distancing, economic stress, barriers to mental health treatment, national anxiety, and a spike in gun sales. I found another statistic: Cook County, that's Chicago, has noticed a 13% increase, and Fresno, California, a 70% increase. And I found a summer survey from the CDC that showed 1 in 10 of those surveyed had considered suicide in the previous month. Every source I read said we must talk about it. Now, another aspect of the book that touched me in different places were places where I heard the heart of a pastor crying for his flock, for God's people everywhere. As I hear in this section on suicide and the axioms, I can hear Rev. Mark's grief for those who attempt suicide and for those who love them. So I want to look at the axioms. The first axiom is we are so much more than the worst thing we have ever done, even suicide. I have little experience with suicide, but I grew up in a community where shame and stigma was most definitely associated with suicide. If the axiom is true that we're so much more than the worst thing we have ever done, even suicide, why is shame and stigma associated with suicide?
I think the people around the people that commit suicide think they should have been able to buck up, to be able to, they should have been able to handle whatever it is. And maybe even communicate that to the person before they decide they know they can't do that, they're not that perfect, and become even more depressed about it.
Okay, that's one reason, yes.
And I was just going to say, because anything related to mental illness is stigmatized. So if you have any kind of struggle where you can't buck yourself up and be happy and, you know, all of those things, then unfortunately in our culture, it's really considered weakness, and something that you have a choice over, which certainly, you know, from time to time we have choices that we can make. But unlike physical health related issues, we can look at that objectively and say, oh my gosh, I feel so bad for them. They were a victim of this horrible disease. Well, guess what? Mental health is a disease too. And we still have a long way to go as a culture to really see it that way, and to give people the same benefit of the doubt when they're struggling.
A really good point. Thank you. That stigma that we still attach to mental illness.
You know, I think it's also worth noting that Mark noted in the book that the Catholic Church is considered a sin, but there's no place in the Bible that it says it's a sin to kill yourself. So, you know, that doesn't help that there's a whole religion out there that puts a negative connotation on it.
And I grew up in a really, really dominant Roman Catholic community. And yes, that was my experience.
I'll bring Brene Brown back into it with the simple, I think it was her first video that she really experienced the shame of vulnerability when she said what she said. And yet in the later, as you read deeper, it takes courage. And it's the courage to be vulnerable and to ask for forgiveness or find that place in your soul where courage gets you on to the next step in your life. And that can be difficult for somebody who's an adolescent or somebody who's in that middle age group, especially after the loss of a loved one or suicide.
I think part of the stigma too is a lot of times if we know someone that's really struggling with life, there's a stigma there where we can't say, are you thinking about hurting yourself? Because we're afraid if we do that, it might actually trigger them to start thinking about it. And that's one of the worst things ever I think you can do it. If you think somebody's struggling, and it's okay to say, are you going to hurt yourself? Or are you thinking about it? And I think that the two ways that I was taught in Stephen ministry to really watch for is, do they have a means and do they have a way? Excuse me, do they have a means and do they have a plan? And if you hear that, then you really have to take it seriously. But I think that's one of the hardest questions to ask is, are you going to hurt yourself? Or also, are you planning on hurting somebody else because you're in this bad place? And it's something that's got to be brought up. And I know we have a couple of therapists here, maybe they could chime in on that. I don't want to put them on the spot, but there's some stigma there with just asking those questions.
Yeah, you're right, Ron. I think there's lots of stigma about asking the questions. We are afraid of hearing the answer because not a lot of us are equipped to know what to do if we get an affirmative answer. But I think also just sort of in general, a lot of us are uncomfortable being in the presence of someone else's discomfort and pain. And so it's hard to have those conversations where someone is in so much pain where they're thinking about killing themselves. And so I think we maybe talk around it or avoid the question so that we also don't have to feel those painful feelings. But you're right about the means and intent being sort of the important things to look for. And I think people can talk about thinking about suicide or wishing they were better off dead without maybe being at risk for actually following through with death by suicide. And that's where I think conversations can get really uncomfortable for the other person participating in that, to sort of talk about those as concepts and just be comfortable sitting there talking about it and not really necessarily needing to intervene or knowing how to intervene if the situation calls for it.
I know what did make a difference for my nephew, and he was University of Montana. We were in Salt Lake City, and I just knew something was terribly wrong and called him very late at night. He was almost unintelligible on the phone, but I finally got the understanding that he had the shotgun that was his roommate's and was attempting to kill himself, but couldn't figure out how to take the safety off. And he said that he had been sitting there thinking that nobody would care if he had died, except Aunt Jan would care. And I called. So I think if you are in one of those situations where you have a person that, and I don't care how close or how far your relationship is, I think if you say, I would care if you killed yourself, I think it might not stop it, but it might stop it. It stopped Jeff.
Thank you. Yes. The second axiom said suicide is preventable, but our personal power to prevent others from taking their own lives is finite. So what's the positive and the negative side of this axiom? Well, okay, so one question at a time. What's the positive side of this axiom? I'll read it again. Suicide is preventable, but our personal power to prevent others from taking their own lives is finite.
I think the positive side is that it is preventable, and that we just heard a great story from Janet Ford about how we can intervene and can have a great effect.
But so what's the negative side of this axiom?
It doesn't
We
always
won't always
work.
be able to do it.
Right. I mean, we can't always do it.
Not everyone speaks up like Janet did when she made the call. And it was like an angel tapping you on the shoulder and saying, I need to call this loved one. And this happens every day.
I think on the other side of that, though, I think a positive of that axiom is that it can relieve some of the burden and guilt and grief if someone views themselves as being unsuccessful in saving someone's life, of why didn't I do more? Why couldn't I have stopped that person? Because that is a true fact, that it's not always possible for an individual in any given moment to stop it, and people are burdened with a heavy amount of guilt if they feel like they didn't do enough to stop someone from dying by suicide.
And I think that's one of the reasons for this axiom, is to alleviate that guilt that loved ones have. So the third and fourth axioms, suicide is a permanent solution to a temporary problem. And the worst thing that happened to you does not have to be the last thing. So what do you hear expressed in these axioms? Suicide is a permanent solution to a temporary problem. The worst thing that has happened to you does not have to be the last thing.
What I hear is the glass is half full. There is hope.
There is hope.
I hear resiliency. I mean, that's one of the things that we've been talking about with that, trying to teach young people, is to have that resiliency to be able to bounce back or find a way out of a bad situation.
I think we have a lot of opportunity also to, it's not always about the moment of suicide. It's about the care and the love and the concern and the outreach and the relationship that we can have with other people. And it doesn't even necessarily have to be with people that you know, just showing kindness and being compassionate and positive. Sometimes I do think we get a little hung up. I get a little hung up on we've got to be positive all the time. And sometimes it's okay to feel your feelings and not be positive all the time. But I do think we have an opportunity to think back so that we can think forward, if that makes any sort of sense. That we can kind of treat our actions with others in a way that would help to support and affirm and show them value and show them love, and maybe help them believe that about themselves before we get, or they get too deep or far away.
What can the person who's feeling suicidal, what are some of the options for that person?
Well, I think, Panay, part of that is, I think, I'm looking at the statistics for the younger people, and they don't have the life perspective. And so if the boyfriend or the girlfriend breaks up with them, it's the end of the world right there, and nothing's ever going to be good again. And so they really don't have any options in their mind, because they're like Mark talks about, their brain isn't fully developed. And so something that an adult would look at on and say, yeah, it's just a little high school romance, you'll be fine 20 years from now. They don't have that perspective.
Well, I think too that, and I've got some personal experience with this, that I think what really touched me in the book, and this is really true, is that we put so much stress on our kids to succeed. And my son, when he was in third grade, they had a college day. I'm like, he's in third grade, right? I mean, come on. But when you start that young, making kids feel like they have to have an Ivy League degree, they have to have a 6-figure job, they have to have the big house, they've got to have all these things. The pressure that it puts on them to make the grade. And in Texas, I can tell you, in Plano and in Allen, Texas, I spoke to 2 or 3 therapists there and psychiatrists, and they said that the bulk of their cases that had to do with depression and anxiety were children between the ages of 12 and 16 that were dealing with the stress of academic success. And it's just mind blowing. And I think that that's where we need to start. Like, we need to make kids feel like, you know what, you are more than your GPA, right? You are more than the sum of your achievements. And you know what? If you want to go to vocational school and learn how to be a plumber, God bless you. You know what I mean? That's good for you. And, you know, all I ever tried to do with all of my girls personally was just say, look, I don't care what you do, as long as you're productive and you're happy. If you're productive and you're fulfilled in what you're doing, I don't care if you're mucking stalls. Those are the only two things I'm caring about. You know, so I just think kids, I think we really need to pay attention to that with our kids and the way that we talk to them and the kind of standards that we set for them.
Jerry, I definitely agree with that. As part of, I mentioned a few weeks ago that I run the statewide crisis system through the Department of Human Services. And part of our research in how we can better reach young people, we actually recruited young people to help us make messaging that was relevant for them. So it was themes that they felt like, you know, were reflective of the struggles that they were going through. And then the call to action was to reach out to the crisis line. And far and away, pressure and expectations were the number one reason that kids said that they were really struggling. And sort of nationwide research backs that up too. Kids feeling like they have too much pressure to perform and succeed, and then really lacking important life skills to figure out how to be resilient and independent when they get to sort of be physically independent and out of their parents' homes. So they may be really good test takers, pretty good athletes, but really don't have many skills to know how to cope with day-to-day challenges. And their sort of baseline is already heightened because of the excess pressure and expectations that are placed on them from the external world. And some of that definitely is reflected in or relates to social media usage. I think social media can be a strength, but also certainly that sort of always on, always comparing, always being able to be impacted by bullies, as other folks at the beginning of this meeting mentioned. All of those lead to those feelings of pressure and expectation. There's many sources, but for sure that was the thing that they said, like, that's what's killing our peers. And that's not hyperbole, like literally killing our peers through suicide.
Another factor that I found in the book, especially if you think about the bridge in San Francisco, that people who they were able to keep from jumping, and those people who got help, who got counseling or got needed medications, how that changed their life. So I think that's another aspect that I'm not sure we've talked about yet. Does anybody have any experience with both counseling and medications to help in these lines?
If I may, the admissions director out at CU Hospital told me several years ago the greatest need at that time, which was 12 to 15 years after Columbine, was for help for students and teachers who had not sought counseling to begin with, had found other mechanisms of coping, addiction, whatever, and didn't have insurance because the insurance industry had blacklisted them because they were Columbine. That is a problem. And when the money was raised for Columbine, she told me, They spent it on a memorial to the students, whereas that same money could have been providing the assistance that was needed by the students and their families to get help for a loved one. And so they were looking everywhere they could to find the money from foundations, from individuals, to fill that need so they could be admitted to the hospital for help. It's just a tragedy. Every time there's a trauma, every time there's anything like it, someone takes their own life, it's a trauma on the whole community and the family. So I'll leave it at that.
So there are some barriers to getting help, some economic barriers to getting help, you're saying.
It concerns me a little bit that we're spending so much time talking about the suicide aspect. And I really feel the reason that he put social isolationism and suicide together was because it's the social isolationism that ends up driving that. It's not, it's our young people not feeling comfortable that they have an outlet, have somebody that they can talk to when those issues first arise. One of the things that came to my mind, Barbara, when you were talking and mentioned neighbors, I feel so fortunate to have grown up in a family that did have dinner together, in a family where my father worked, my mother didn't. And my mother was a neighbor and brought a circle of friends from the church and from the neighborhood together. And I could always count on her in that group of friends as being a resource and an outlet for concerns or emotions. And I think, that's, it takes me back as well to inequality and the economy that we're struggling with, that has put so many mothers to work as well, and no longer being a resource for their growing children that are facing these impacts. I think we need to work more on social isolationism to resolve the suicide situation that we're facing.
To that point, again, St. Andrew, to eradicate social isolation and disconnection by practicing the faithful presence of the incarnate Christ. Well, let's think beyond what St. Andrew can do. What can we as individuals do? I mean, we can personally take a bit of ownership of this problem too. What can we do individually? Or maybe what are some things you have already done? Janet made that phone call. What do you feel called to do?
I was a community sponsor of the Gay Straight Alliance at Highlands High School for 14 years to help prevent suicide. In that time, I'm only aware of one completed suicide, but I will always support my youth. Thank you.
Okay.
I think one thing that, I would challenge all of us to do is, I understand the intricacies of social media and technology and all of those things. I've always found it ironic that in the COVID environment, the very technology we fear has become our last bastion of ways to connect, right? So when I think about that, I think about my young kids and my 20-year-olds, and I think this is the challenge, right? Is that we need to rethink how Dave said, for example, how do we create those connections in different ways, in 21st century ways, that are just as meaningful as the connections that were made 30 years ago around the dinner table? And I think that's a good question. I mean, maybe I'm oversimplifying, but when I sit here and look at this screen and see all of you, and think to myself, all of you are here and have been here for 5 weeks. I've had people on these calls that I've never met face to face that I feel like I know now. And, you know, I think that social media and all of these things, I think they can be used in really positive ways. And, you know, the fact of the matter is that I think Mark has said this before, our faith is not a backward looking faith. Okay. We're not going to go back to the good old days. The church needs to move forward into the future and try to think about creative ways to adapt and to innovate and to maintain those faithful connections and incarnate presences in new and interesting ways. And I think that if we do that very purposefully, I think that's how we're going to connect with the new generation. I really do. So I don't know. That's just my thought. Those are the kinds of things that my nerdy brain thinks about in the middle of the night when I wake up. So, but I love what you said, Dave. I think you're right. You know, I think that eradicating social isolation is getting at the root cause. I just kind of ponder about how we do that in the 21st century, you know? Yeah.
I think to build on that thought, which, you know, and I think you used the word purposeful, and I would maybe add to that be more deliberate. You know, some of those social interactions and senses of community and neighborhood was just the way things happened to work out because of the way neighborhoods worked. You know, there wasn't, you know, air conditioning and TVs to watch, and people just developed those habits. I think now, under the circumstances we're in, we just have to be more deliberate about ways to find those connections where they're missing. And so be on the lookout for that and look out for ways to make connections wherever possible. No matter what it is, whether it's family meals or potlucks or talking to your neighbor across the fence, just interacting with people more deliberately rather than just kind of going on about our lives without paying any attention to it. That was just kind of my thought about that.
I think we all know people who are lonely, who live alone now, who don't have family near, and just pick up the old telephone and call people and make connections that way. Personal voices back and forth and sharing, I think, are so important.
I think given in this time of social media, it's very important that we have places like St. Andrew that are online and are safe spaces, because there is so much mischief. Safe spaces are invaluable to our youth and adults.
And Laura, you were going to say something?
I was just, if anybody knows a senior in high school right now, as a college counselor, this weekend is the first big application deadline. And so I have been experiencing in my school that the pressures that we've talked about, those anxieties, those nerves, those am I good enough? They're about to send out these applications and hopefully trust that whoever's reading them is going to get a sense of who they are. So if you know a senior or know seniors at the church, don't ask them where they're applying or give them any pressure about that, please. But certainly just sending them a little bit of love that they are exactly who they are supposed to be and that they are going to be exactly who they should be could be really nice, I think, for something that we could all do now.
As an older person, one of the things we need to learn to do is to text. If I'm going to communicate with my grandchildren, I have to text them.
I'm so glad you said that, Janet. You know, my mentor in Dallas, he is 93 years old, and that man is a texting maniac. I'm telling you, he is a smartphone maniac. So yeah, I'm so glad you said that. That made me laugh.
You need slim fingers, we've discovered.
But then you watch all the young people, they do it with their thumbs. I still don't get that.
Yeah.
I think to what Jerry said and several other people too, I think the youth group at our church is going in such a good direction because even though they're not meeting at the church now, and they never always have had outside activities where they go get pizza, they go to a movie, they go to a park. I mean, when I was in a youth group, we went to church and read the Bible and had Kool-Aid and cookies and left, and it was really boring. But the church isn't pounding religion down these kids' throat. It's taking them out and say, let's have fun as a group from this church and invite your friends and make it a social situation. And I think that's what so many churches really need to move towards, that model of let's engage the kids in what they like to do and just let them spend time together.
Thank you. One of the things, everything I would Google and read said no risk factors. And in our book on page 95, risk factors were learned, but there's lists of risk factors everywhere. Something else I ran across, I'm just talking about things we can individually do. And Megan, maybe you know about it, probably do. The Second Wind Fund. There's a fund in Colorado, it started Denver Metro, that will take people who can't, young people who can't afford therapy sessions and give them up to 12 therapy sessions for suicide prevention. So there's that too. The scripture in the chapter was about the rich young man. And I think that rich young man in the Bible story in the chapter needs to unsocially sort himself. Now, I know that's not a word, unsocially, but he needs to unsocially sort himself and go and make a difference. The epilogue in the book suggests that we're not nearly as polarized as it currently seems. And I wonder if that's been your experience personally, that we really aren't as polarized as it seems. And okay, I know that if you're talking about football or baseball, and I know there's a World Series game on right now, that we might be terribly polarized. But I also have seen those two men who are running for the governor of Utah. They're new friends now. They're different political parties, of course, but they know they really want the same basic things. They just disagree on the best way to get there. But I was just wondering very briefly, because our time is almost up, if you have also experienced, and this is for the whole book, that we aren't as polarized as it sometimes seems. Nobody's had that experience. Yeah.
I think it's true. I think we get drawn into discussion and argument about things we disagree on because it's more dramatic, and we are able to argue about those easier. And it's not always as much fun to draw out conversations on what we agree on, but it's so true. We do agree on things theologically and politically, but we gravitate toward those things we can disagree and argue about. And I think it's happening in politics and personal relationships.
So we can choose to be argumentative or not.
Sure, it's drama. It's exciting to argue and disagree.
Well, I want to thank you all for sharing tonight and for sharing all of these weeks. It's been an amazing adventure, like some of you have said. So thank you very much. For the closing prayer, again, I'm going to pop it up on the screen, and I invite you to mute yourself and read along. God, our creator, you give breath to each person you made. You treasure the gifts of each unique person. But when life becomes a burden rather than a gift, God of life, hold us. When darkness strangles the will to live, when days become endless nights, God of light, shine on us. When no one seems to understand, when we walk and wait alone, God of love, embrace us with your presence. Where there is despair, bring hope. Where there is shame, give value and worth. Where there is emptiness, bring fulfillment. Where there is suffering in mind and body, bring healing. God of hope, hear our prayer for life. Amen.
Thank you, Panay. Good class.
Well,
Thank you, everybody.
all.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you for
Yes,
all
thanks,
you've done.
Renee.
Thank you for you people.
Thank you,
who
Panay.
run the
Thank
Sessions.
you.
Steve.
It was lovely. Good session tonight.
Appreciate it.
It's been a good series, and let's let Mark know that too. Email him and tell him what a good
Yeah.
book and time we had in the series.
And I did invite Mark. I wanted him to know that if he wanted to come, he's very, very welcome, but he's a very busy man. We keep him that way.
Right. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you,
Thanks,
everyone.
Steve.
Yeah, thanks, Steve.
Thanks, Panay. Thanks, Steve.
Person one day.